I'll take us through some brief introductions as we wait for a couple people to trickle in. I know that the top of the hour is a little bit ambitious, so we'll be generous with our time here. And I'll speak slowly, we'll take it easy. Thank you everyone who's joining right now. Welcome. I'm Bronwyn Hudson, your host for this Uptycs Live webinar. And welcome. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. We've got a fascinating topic for you today. We're going to be covering understanding attack paths and risks in the cloud. I'm going to take you through a couple administrative pieces and then we'll dive right in. As per usual, chat is disabled, but Q&A is open. So please feel free to submit questions at any point during the session, but we'll take them all at the end. But feel free to pop them in whenever they are relevant. And then, as you likely already know, this is part one of two webinars in this series. So on Friday this week at the same time, that's 11 a.m. Eastern, we'll be taking more of a deeper dive into some of the Uptycs tools that we're going to be briefly talking about today and talking about some of the concerns that we'll be covering in this webinar. So please join us for that, and I'll remind you at the end as well. So welcome to our two experts we've got on board today, Andre and Sudarsan. Sudarsan, I'm going to start with you. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bronwyn. Glad to meet everybody virtually. I'm Sudarsan Kannan. I'm the Director of Product here at Uptycs. I've been here for close to 3 years now. Prior to Uptycs, I've been in RSA and Symantec. I come from the breeds of the well-known established security companies. I worked across identity, endpoints, and cloud. So happy to be here. Happy to take questions at the end of the call, as Bronwyn said. Great to partner with Andre as well.
Fabulous. Andre, can I kick things over to you?
Yeah, thanks. So I've been at Uptycs for about 2 years now. I oversee the cloud security threat research team. Prior to Uptycs, I was with AWS for about 5 and a bit years, where in my recent role, I oversaw the account takeover team within the fraud prevention org. Prior to that, I was at Rackspace, served in various roles, ran security teams. And prior to that, I was actually with Rapid7 back in the day.
Back in the day, I love it. Vintage. Fabulous. So I want to start out with you, Andre. Given your previous experience with AWS in these more specific roles that you've had, let's start about talking about the complexities of cloud security in general. So the big question kind of in the air is like, what makes cloud different and what makes it so difficult? Can you take us through some introduction to that?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the cloud is extremely complex to get right. You think about the cloud and what it allows for, offers, but you have human identities, you have machine identities, and because of the ephemeral nature of the cloud, these identities are constantly changing. So trying to keep up with the visibility into all of these, including all the data they produce, is really challenging, even if you have the best tools out there. On top of that, the cloud has thousands of APIs, thousands of permissions that these types, or excuse me, these identities can potentially have access to. And sometimes knowingly or unknowingly, cloud users get it wrong and they create an attack path into into the environments. So now imagine, you have all this data and you now have to consume it to understand what's going on. You preferably would like a visual of what your environment looks like, and to understand, A, what is talking to what, but then B, what are the security risks present within those interconnected resources. But even then, even if you can do it at that point, it's still difficult for security teams because you lack the context, right? So the context around a particular security risk and how do you prioritize that? I'll give you some examples, right? So, if you think about your security data, you'd want to know the cloud context, right? So what are the configurations? Are there any network exposures? Is there an attack path present? You then think about the workload context. Are there vulnerabilities in those workloads? Are there secrets stored on those workloads? And is there sensitive data present in those workloads? And then thirdly, the business context. So what type of environment is this? Is this a staging? Is it a production environment? Which team is assigned to that environment? And then lastly, is it a critical resource? right? Certain resources are critical within customers' environments. Others are just not going to be critical. So to remove the complexity, what we at Uptycs are trying to do is we are visualizing your entire environment for you, and we're applying these three contexts and all the criteria to your security data. What this does is it determines your risk scorecard, which is extremely important when we think about surfacing, excuse me, any attack surfaces in your account, right? If we're going to surface an attack, an attack path, if we're going to surface an attack path, you would want to know the context around that attack path. And that's what Uptycs does a really good job of. Now, what exactly is an attack path? Well, our attack path reveals the possible entry points into resources in your environment, as well as the internal movements from those resources to other resources in your environment. So imagine a scenario where you have an internet-facing cloud asset that's compromised. It might seem minor, but this could be the start of a really complex attack that customers should be wary of. For example, someone opens up your security group to the internet, threat actor SSH brute forces their way to the instance. From here, they're able to use the attached role credentials to jump into, say, S3, or they can send a temporary SSH key to another EC2 instance, then get access to that. So for us, our goal is to understand the paths and how they evolve, so that we can anticipate and counteract them effectively. As mentioned before, an attack path on its own may not be interesting or important without that context. But by applying the cloud workload and business context, we not only help customers make sense of the security risk, but we also help you prioritize that risk in the risk prioritization view. Because the security teams are inundated. They're overwhelmed with alerts, detections. Where do you start? So what is the risk prioritization view, and why is it important? As mentioned, security teams are just inundated. So identifying the risks that are critical and addressing them first will make a significant difference in keeping the environment secure. There is no worse feeling for a security team to get in there, identify all these alerts, all these risks, and not know where to start, or using their best judgment to determine where to actually start. If you think about a cloud environment, and going back to what I said earlier, there's a lot of data being generated. Trying to discern and detect for nefarious behavior versus expected behavior is very, very challenging. You may have a senior security analyst say, this is nefarious behavior, whereas the junior analysts who get those tier one first alerts may say, hey, this looks like expected behavior. But what we're trying to do with Uptycs is really help you prioritize it and give you the evidence, give you the data to say, here is why this is a high risk. And then, as you think about when you surface these risks, giving that evidence is important, right? So like I said, giving the evidence, knowing that where you can go in and spend your time and prioritize your time to actually work on those alerts. A couple of examples of just, why or where risk prioritization can really help. So if you think about an exposed resource to the internet, so, let's assume it has a critical vulnerability running on it, but it's part of your staging environment with no access to production, that will most likely get pushed down the list. Because as we think about the peripheral connections and information, and we've applied the context, right, that's sending us a message saying that it's in an environment that isn't critical, and it doesn't have access to any production critical information. Whereas a different scenario, if you have an exposed resource that has zero critical vulnerabilities, but it has permissions to access a critical asset like an S3 bucket, which is housing production data, that will probably get pushed to the top of the list of risks. So we help you push that to the top. We show you why we're saying this is a critical risk. And all the while we're doing this, it's a dynamic process that our systems are continuously evaluating on the back end. So let's assume you make a change, and that to a security group, as an example, that risk will now get dropped in the risk priority list automatically, so that your team isn't chasing something that's already been fixed 5 minutes ago. So anyway, that's a little bit about risk prioritization and attack path. But want to turn it over to Sudarsan. Sudarsan, give us your thoughts on risk prioritization since you are developing this for the product.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andre. So one thing that, to Andre's point, right, when you think about the context, Andre talked about three key topics, right? One is around cloud context, the workload context, and the business context. So let's go through one by one, and we have to talk about why those are relevant and what are the different signals that we collect from those contexts, right? Let's start with the cloud context. Within the cloud context, from a control plane perspective, to Andre's point, how do you know if an asset is exposed to the internet, right? You might have some web servers that you really want to be exposed, but there are some services like your database instances should not be exposed to the internet, or your serverless functions should not be exposed to the internet. So certain functions, right? So we take into account, first thing is we look at whether that asset is exposed to the internet or not from a cloud context. Number two, we look at, are there any misconfigurations on that specific asset? A case in point is, if you think about an S3 bucket, should that S3 bucket be publicly accessible? Does that S3 bucket have the right permissions? Are you allowing everybody in the internet, in the whole wide internet, to be accessing that S3 bucket, right? So it could be a misconfiguration. And again, to Andre's point, cloud is so complex that oftentimes a lot of security organizations kind of oversee, or it's a blind spot, right? You don't know what you have configured. You don't have visibility into where the misconfiguration lies. But bringing that into surface in terms of understanding the context is very key, right? So then a third part is your attack paths. To Andre, based on what he said, why is attack path important, right? Essentially, you're trying to see if an asset is compromised. You want to see the downstream impact on your other assets that are in your same subnet or same, let's say, VPC or a similar region. You want to see if that is leading up to accessing your sensitive data. Let's say you have a PCI, you're subjected to PCI, PHI, PI, you have PII data. How do you make sure that attack path doesn't lead you to the sensitive data in your environment? All of those things is very relevant from a cloud context perspective, right? The second, what we talk about, it's not only about the cloud context, you need to know what is running within the workload on the cloud. Let's take, if you're running Azure VM or a Google Cloud VM or your AWS EC2 instances, you need to have a deep visibility into those workloads. When I say visibility, you can see you can have visibility through very at the surface level. But if you want to have visibility at every process running within your workloads, you need to have that visibility to determine the risk in your environment. You're running different workloads. You might be running a very critical workload in your production. You might be running a quality stack in a non-critical environment. You're going to have a mix of business critical applications running in an environment, right? But how do you provide that visibility with the least friction possible? So that is where what we help with organizations is we provide the least friction way wherein you can actually get that visibility into your workloads. And at the same time, we can also provide deep visibility on those workloads. I'll give an example what the deep visibility means, right? A deep visibility means, can I get the vulnerability data from that workload running on a cloud? For number one, how do I know if that vulnerable application is actually lying on the disk versus whether it's actually loaded into the memory, right? How do I know if that vulnerable package and associated with the process is actually running as a privileged node? Because if you're running a privileged operation, that means an attacker can easily compromise, and they don't even have to escalate privileges when they compromise that workload. So that is very critical. And you also want to have a real-time visibility on your vulnerable applications in your workload. Case in point is, I'm sure everybody's aware of the Log4j incident, right? If you think about Log4j, I'm sure everybody's scurried around. They were huddling together. There is a lot of challenges across your teams, and you're trying to prioritize which one should I go fix first, because Log4j was so prevalent. And which one should I go and address that first was always a challenge for every organization. Now, you got to remediate that vulnerability really fast. How do you get that prioritization done, to Andre's point, right? How do you get the prioritization? That's really key. So from a workload context, you need to know the vulnerability. You also need to know, are there any ports open in that, right? especially on the critical workloads, are you seeing any detections on those workloads? Are you seeing any anomalous behavior and to nefarious behavior on that workload? That is really critical to understand. Should I go and address that workload as a first issue? So the third part is around, we talked about vulnerabilities. You also want to know whether there are secrets in those workloads running, right? If there are no secrets or if there are no credentials that is out there in your, because you typically a developer can check in your GitHub through the check-ins, they can actually put your AWS key in GitHub and then it can be baked into as part of your image, and that image is being persisted in the cloud. How do you make sure your workloads do not have secrets, and can we detect those secrets in the workload, right? That is, so all that together is a workload context, right? The third piece, we talked about cloud, we talked about workload. Now the business context, right? The business context is, I'm sure a lot of organizations use CMDB, they have ServiceNow, they have different tool sets, but at the end of the day, all these tool sets provide business critical infrastructure, business critical information. Where do I have PII data? Where do I have PHI data? Where do I have my sensitive information stored on those environments? The storing can be in your object storage, in your block storage, in your instances, it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, ability to find and trace that critical information is very important. And number two, I'm sure a lot of big organizations and even small organizations are different disparate teams or silos of teams. Every team has their own charter and their goals. But how do you bring all that together for somebody like a security operations to go back to the respective teams and hand off these specific issues for remediation, right? So that is also important. For that, how do you get that business context? That's very critical to prioritize also. So at the end of the day, we bring all that together in a single unified way. And we'll go through the demo as Bronwyn talked about tomorrow, how we bring all this data together. But essentially, we kind of break down the silos and bring all the data together in a single view and provide the rich security context for you to either prioritize or even not prioritize. You can say, no, this is not a critical information for me. I'm not going to worry about it right now, but I'm going to worry in other areas, right? That is really critical when it comes to solving that complex problem that Andre talked about through this risk prioritization. That's exactly how we help get into the depth, the weeds of how we can help you prioritize risk.
Fabulous. It's a great deep dive, and we'll go actually more into that on Friday. Sudarsan, before we move on from you, can you also talk a little bit about the value of sensors?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing, so if you look at the broader industry, right? A lot of organizations have two approaches. One is they want to have a frictionless way to monitor and provide visibility to workloads. At the same time, there are critical workloads where they do need deep telemetry. They exactly want to know what processes are running, and they want to monitor and find any detections happening and actually have detections on those workloads. The latter part where they want to have a deep telemetry, where they want to monitor those critical, not every workload, some critical workloads where they want to have that visibility, that's where sensors come and play a lot of value to organizations. The second piece where sensor has lots of value is if you want to have a real-time information, like Log4j is a classic example. If you want to have sensors can give you that information within a couple of seconds, wherein that can send the data back to the cloud and say, okay, here are the packages impacted, here are the actual assets impacted because of the Log4j. You can get that data really. The real-time aspect is key for what the sensor can bring to the table. But again, it depends on organization risk profile. Some organizations only prefer a sensorless approach. Some organizations prefer sensorless based approach. But at the end of the day, we kind of cater to different risk profiles of risk of organizations. It's good to have both approaches. Sometimes it's good to have one or the other, depending on where the customer, what the organization is coming from.
Yeah, and just to add to that, to Sudarsan's point, right? Different customers are going to have different needs, right? So production and maybe a sensor, staging and maybe agentless snapshot scanning. What my team has found is that threat actors will start looking at if you solely deploy agentless scanning, they're going to look and find that snapshot schedule, right? So it takes it every 24 hours, once every 24 hours. If I'm a threat actor, I'm sniffing around the logs, I'm finding out what those snapshots are, when they're being taken. And a minute after that snapshot's been taken, I'm gonna, access that instance, right? Or exploit the instance and try and take data from it, move laterally using that instance. So, but again, we offer both, customers have different needs, but I would caution against solely relying on agentless just because it's not a tried and trusted method for detecting nefarious behavior.
Very wise. I think being able to offer both, having the option of both, having a choice is the key here. Absolutely. Andre, I want to go back to one thing that both you and Sudarsan kind of briefly mentioned, which is visibility. So one of the big questions is time, right? We need to have quick turnaround on these detections and being able to get visibility into these issues. So how quickly can companies get visibility into attack paths, into anything that you've showed us, and like what does the integration look like right there?
Yeah, so it's depending on the size of an environment, you can get visibility within a couple of minutes, right? A couple of minutes to tens of minutes, depending on the size of the environment. So but the prerequisite to that is what you mentioned, is integration, right? So what we do for integration, for example, AWS, we will deploy a role in your accounts. We'll give you the instructions on how to do it via Terraform or CloudFormation. We then assume that role, and essentially at that point, we then begin ingesting your data from your environments into our data lake. And that happens, the integration piece happens within seconds. So seconds to integrate, tens of seconds to begin seeing data show up in our unified portal.
Speedy. Love it. Well, thank you so much. So I think one of the things that is constantly a reminder is that managing attack paths in the clouds and really understanding them at all in any cloud environment is a very multifaceted challenge. You have to have the technical insight, you've got to have planning, but you also have to have the tools. So I want to point our attendees here towards a couple of resources that we already have available, as well as re-invite you to join our webinar that will do more of a deep dive into our product on Friday. So Andre, you've written a fabulous series of blogs that go into these topics. All of these are available. We'll send out the slides after this presentation. They're linked in here and they're available on the Uptycs blog. And the first one is really what we've dived into here, understanding attack paths on like a really granular level and being able to talk about risk from a strategic viewpoint as well. We also have blogs that Andre has written that are fabulous that go into each of these topics. And also a reminder that on Friday, you are already registered for this series, but please join us for that. So right now we will open the floor to some questions. And let me just get these up and running. Okay, fabulous. This is a great question. So a little bit like we just asked before, when you're looking at an attack path, how quickly will that visual actually update? Andre, you might want to take that one.
Yeah, I think the question is, if you have this attack path and something in your environment changes, how quick or dynamically does that visual change in our user interface? It's within seconds. For example, we tested this out where we had several S3 buckets. We then marked one of them as critical, and then we looked at it, and within seconds it showed up as a critical resource that dynamically changed the risk prioritization. So anyway, long story short, it's within seconds.
Gotcha. And Sudarsan, you might want to take this one. What sources of data can you use to determine the three contexts and the risk prioritization?
Absolutely. We look at several data sources beginning in the cloud. We look at the misconfiguration. So when you do misconfiguration, we connect to the cloud APIs. We bring in all the telemetry. We look for the state changes that is happening if an EC2 came up or down. If a Google VM went up or down, we have that state change information, number one. Number two, we get all the logs. What happened in that environment in the cloud? Those logs are primarily used for detection and spotting anomalies in a cloud environment. We also bring in Kubernetes. If you're running, when you're really a cloud native organization where you have containers and you have a managed orchestration platform like a Kubernetes, whether it's a Google Cloud or whether it's a Azure AKS or whether you have EKS from AWS, whatever the Kubernetes cluster, we bring in the cluster data. And also we look at the critical data. We look at where does the sensitive data reside. We look at, as we said before, we have the ability to look at deep into your workloads, whether it's what processes are running, what ports are open, what are the vulnerabilities. All the data is the sources from those different areas, right? Whether we use a disk scanning / agentless, we do that, we provide the data from there. And in addition to that, we can also get data from the sensors and the log data. All three together is what is combined in our security lake. And based on the security lake, we have built outcomes to reduce the risk in a cloud environment.
Fabulous. I've had another question just come in as you were speaking. I think you partially answered this, but what are you doing for vulnerability monitoring for Kubernetes clusters? Do you want to expand on a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So vulnerabilities, we look at a couple of things, right? When it Kubernetes clusters, we do have compliance checks. We do support NSA hardening guidelines to strengthen the cluster. Even NSA recommends that you need to harden the cluster because that's a kind of a protecting your perimeter. Cluster is the most critical, where you have a etcd, you have your storage, your persistent volume. There are different areas within Kubernetes. We make sure we provide configurations out of the box to strengthen those. That's number one. From vulnerabilities within the workloads running on the containers, let's say there's a container image, we do scan for the container images for vulnerabilities on any secrets or malware, and then surface that into a cloud so that you have a unified view across Kubernetes and containers.
Fabulous. And I can send out some more resources about that as well. We've got some great things on the blog too. I've got a very direct question, which I totally love. Sudarsan, maybe you can take this one as well. Who are our main competitors and what's our competitive advantage?
Yeah, absolutely. We have different competition. Like if you start from the big players like Palo Alto Prisma, you think about Wiz, you have other vendors. Depend on what if you look at purely from a CSPM, definitely you can look at Prisma Cloud and we can look at Wiz as a competitor. How are we different? How are we different is we provide that in a unified fashion, right? You don't have to look at 10 different tools to bring the data in. It's a single data lake, single security lake, single UI, single schema, wherein you can bring all the data in a single place and then provide that ability. You don't have to switch 10 different screens. You're driving your security operation efficiency through this one tool. The other one is around a lot of vendors today support agentless disk scanning, which we also do. We also believe that in addition to that, you need to have a flexibility or choice to have a sensor-based approach, right? We need the best of both worlds. That is where we bring the best of both worlds. And that is where the depth that we talked about earlier, how do you get visibility into a process running in a vulnerable container, a vulnerable process running in a container? Those all comes from a sensor-based approach. So we provide the best of both worlds, and you can pick and choose what you want. That is where our strength lies.
Great answer. Going back to Kubernetes just a little bit, got a question. What level of access do you use to scan the cluster? More of a specific one, I think.
Yeah, so depends on how you want. If you want to just connect to the Kube API, if those clusters are private, there are different types of, because Kube API is not exposed typically, but you can make it expose certain clusters, you can expose it outside, or you can make it private. If you make it private, then you have to have visibility. We have a collector that actually connects to the Kube API sitting within your environment, right? So that it's still secure and you control over it through however you deploy the clusters using Helm charts or whatever. We provide integrate into the automation framework to collect that telemetry around that cluster. Depends on how you have, but we have different options to support scanning the cluster.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm saying one more question. We're seeing more players join in with attack path. Why is that?
Yeah, so if you think about it, attack path is more of a simulation of how what an attacker could compromise when they leverage a vulnerability or a misconfiguration in your internet-facing asset, right? That's an entry point, or the entry point could be a compromised credentials that they found in GitHub or somewhere in the wild. But at the end of the day, they can move laterally, right? So as a cloud, as an industry by itself, every customer, every prospect, the ecosystem, including the vendors, they are getting on this bandwagon of purple teaming mindset, where we are trying to figure out what are the potential attack path. An attack path is a great way to build a proactive control within your security team so that you can address the issues head on with the right prioritization, right? You need to understand the impact. That's why attack path is something more, you see more and more players getting into the attack path. And that's pretty normal, right? But the one thing that you have to keep in mind, look for depth in your attack path, right? When you pick any solution, look for the depth that those different players provide, because at the end of the day, you do not want to have another false positive in your environment and not think about how to prioritize one over the other, right? Prioritization and the depth of telemetry that you bring into the table to determine the attack path, and that can help reduce false positives. Those are the key things that you need to think about as part of your process, understanding which vendor offers which tools. That's the way that I would put it.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the reason attack path is so, hot right now, it's a visual, right? We as humans, we're all adept to learn quicker and easier by visualizing something. And an attack path will visualize the path an attacker could take in your environment. So now you're getting a window into a threat actor's mindset. If they were to pop a laptop that has SSH keys, that laptop SSHs into a cloud environment, to an EC2 instance, so it's a jump box. They can then SSH from there into a different EC2 instance, scrape the metadata, take the credentials, move laterally, escalate privileges. We visualize all of that. So if we're humans, and especially security teams, seeing that visual quickly allows them to understand what's going on. Even if it's a junior analyst on the team, they can look at it and say, yep, I understand. This seems like it's a high risk, or seems like something that we need to take action on extremely quickly.
Absolutely. I think we're giving people a little bit of a glimpse into what our webinar on Friday will also go more into. So just a reminder that on Friday, we'll be diving into attack path, but we'll also talk about a couple more tools, including security graph and cloud discovery. So please join us for that on Friday. And that concludes our webinar this morning. Andre, Sudarsan, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And to all of our audience members, thank you so much for being here. You can find all of these resources in the Uptycs resource page. Please check out our blog. It's got plenty of deep dives as well. And we hope to see you on Friday. Thank you so much for joining.